And now,
It's on. Good evening, everyone. I'm Micah, and I'll be your event host tonight, and welcome to Greenlight Bookstore. We're excited to host tonight's event with Keith Gessen, presenting his new book, Raising Raffi, The First 5 Years. He'll be talking with Jessica Grose, so you're in for an excellent evening. Before I turn things over to them, just a couple of housekeeping things. Turn off or silent cell phones. Masks are to be worn the whole evening. Signed books are for sale at the register, and Keith will be personalizing afterwards. Recording, while goes well with the recording, it'll be available on YouTube, and a reminder that our store closes at 9. Our interviewer for this evening is Jessica Grose. Grose is an opinion writer at the New York Times, where she writes a newsletter on parenting. She's working on a new book on nonfiction called All Powerful and Totally Useless, The Creation of the Ideal American Mother. She also writes about women's health, culture, and grizzly bears. She will be speaking with our featured author, Keith Gessen. Gessen is the author of A Terrible Country and All the Sad Young Literary Men, and is the founding editor of N+1. He frequently translates work from Russian and is a regular contributor to the New York Times Magazine, The New Yorker, and New York Magazine, and teaches journalism at Columbia. He lives in New York with his wife, the novelist Emily Gould, and their 2 sons. In his new book, Raising Raffi, written over the first 5 years of his son Rafi's life, Gessen examines the profound and overwhelming, often maddening experience of being a dad, and gives us an unsparing, loving account of fatherhood and the surprising, magical, and maddening turns of a child's early years. Right in time for Father's Day. So you're in for something special tonight. Keith will be reading from his book, then Jessica will join him in the conversation, and you'll have a chance to ask your questions after that. So please join me in welcoming Keith and Jessica to the stage.
Everybody, I guess nobody wanted to sit in the... Is this on? Is this working? It's not working.
So yes, thank you for coming. Thank you, Greenlight, for hosting us at our local store. It's really cool to be here. Thank you to my editor, Allison, who is here. She was here.
She's right there.
Oh, hi, Allison. Thank you. Thank you for editing my book. Thank you, Rebecca, who's here, my agent, from the Wiley Agency. Thank you for agenting my book. Thank you to all the parents who are here, who I've talked to on many playgrounds, and who have remained friends with us despite everything. And thank you to Jessica for interlocking with me. It's an honor. So I'm just going to read from about a third of the way through the book. The book is organized, there's some room up front, people in the back.
I'll do it.
The book is organized thematically, and there are chapters on teaching Rafi Russian and finding Rafi at school. And this chapter is called Love and Anger. When your baby is born, you think you are a certain kind of person and are going to be a certain kind of parent. It's all a fantasy. You don't know anything about yourself until your baby gets older. You don't know anything about yourself until the day your adorable little boy looks you in the eye, notices that your face is right up close to him, and punches you in the nose. The first 2 years were physical. Breast milk and poop and Rafi's delicate little head that could so easily bump into something. Lack of sleep, of course. Worries that he would choke on something. But we survived. He hit his head a few times, but not too badly. One time he put a giant dead cockroach in his mouth, but I pulled it out and flushed it down the toilet. I'm very proud of parenting moment. I was very brave. I mean, it was like a really big cockroach. I had to take it with my hand. And then he was 2. He was running around and wearing a little hat, and now we had to prevent him from getting hit by a car. He was a loud and rambunctious boy. He liked jumping up and down in his crib, or on our bed, or on one of us if we made the mistake of lying down. One time my father was visiting, and Rafi wanted to show off, so for half an hour he ran in rapid circles around our small living room yelling, I am fire tuck, I am fire tuck. He got kicked out of daycare for refusing to nap and for jumping up and down on his cot, causing the other children also not to nap. Someone around this time told us that the hard part was just beginning. We couldn't believe it. Harder than no sleep? Harder than waking up every 10 minutes to Google an imaginary symptom? Yes. Rafi had never been placid or well-behaved, but this was different. He now seemed to know what he was doing when he disobeyed us, and this made it so much worse. The advice books called it testing boundaries. That didn't really capture the experience. Testing boundaries was your coworker sending emails on the weekend. This was your coworker when you picked him up starting to scratch you. You turned him around so that he couldn't do that, and he reared his head back and headbutted you. He'd start swinging his little feet and sometimes would catch you in the balls. There was frustration involved, but also actual physical pain. He'd throw his milk bottle at you and it would hit you in the head. Sometimes we tried to reason with him. Other times we gave him a timeout, putting him in his room and locking the door for a few minutes. But he would come back out a few minutes later and just do whatever had gotten him in trouble again. Then he would get another timeout. He noticed the timeouts and he didn't like them, but they didn't seem to affect his behavior very much. I found the episodes of hitting and scratching very upsetting. There was the pain, that was part of it, but there was also the feeling of betrayal. Our little baby boy whom we had fed and clothed and cuddled, was this how he repaid us? Something else as well. Fear. Was this our kid? Was this what he was like? Had we done something wrong as parents that was causing this? Was it too late to correct course? All these thoughts and fears mixed together in moments of conflict and came forth, for me, as outrage. One time was when Emily was already quite pregnant with Rafi's little brother. We had a conflict over dinner. Rafi didn't want to eat his. He demanded a totally different dinner. Emily was inclined to let him have it. I disagreed. We had already run the bath for one thing, and for another, it was a perfectly fine dinner. After some back and forth, Rafi picked up my glass of water and doused me with it. What the fuck? I tore off my wet shirt, picked up Rafi, stripped him of his clothes, and jammed him into the warm bath. He was terrified and bawling. I felt out of control. Emily was scared. She went into the bathroom to comfort Rafi while I stewed in the living room and gradually started to feel remorseful. Eventually, I went to apologize. Emily urged Rafi to accept my apology. Rafi was reluctant. "That is not nice," said Rafi. And it was true. It was turning out that Dada was not nice. I'll stop there.
Shall I just start?
Yeah, interlock you.
That was really lovely. I really enjoyed it. And I wanted to start by talking about how many parenting books you read for this. And so in my anecdotal experience, and also professional experience, as I'm a professional mom, most dads do not read parenting books. And so I even asked Emily, your wife, if you had read these just for kids or because you one day planned to write this book. And she was like, sadly, Keith just read these books. So I wanted to hear, you talk about sort of I know not all dads, but many dads don't read the parenting books. So I wanted to start there, and what inspired you to read so many parenting books?
Yeah, I mean, I read them in total earnest. I read them out of desperation. I think the thing to understand about dads, and yes, not all dads, but I speak for some dads when I say I feel like you have to believe dads when we say that we are totally ignorant. Like the depth of our ignorance is profound. And when I came into a child, when I suddenly had a child, I was like, I don't know what I'm doing. I really genuinely have never thought about this. And it's kind of it's a tough way to try to sell a book. Read my book. I don't know what I'm talking about. But at the beginning, I didn't know what I was talking about, and it was or didn't know what I was doing, and I was desperate for advice. And so whatever came up, whether it was like sleeping, at first it was just like, is he breathing normal? Is this breathing that is kind of fast normal? Is like the color of his poop? Like he had a yellow poop, then he had a black poop, and it was just like this constant sort of looking out the various symptoms. And then, sleep training. I remember walking into the central branch of the Brooklyn Public Library, and I think I was just there to use the bathroom. But then I was like, oh, I kept seeing people on the subway with this book, No Drama, Discipline. Has anybody read that book? No Drama, Discipline? No. But anyway, a few years on, oh yeah? Oh, nice. Oh, this is Jake and Chi. This is parts of it, yeah. Anyway, and I was like, I kept seeing people on the subway, and I was like, there's no way I'm paying $15 for No Drama, Discipline. I'll just look at it in the library. And so I go up to the parenting section. It wasn't there, but instead, and I didn't even take up. It was like a winter day. It was kind of cold, but I had my jacket on, but I didn't take it off. And I start reading this other book, 3-2-1 Magic. Has anybody read this book?
I read a chapter of it.
It's like a 250-page book devoted to counting to 3. It's amazing, and it's awesome. It's a great book. I really recommend it. But basically, and it works. You just start counting, and your kid's like, well, I don't know what's going to happen when we get to 3, but I don't want to know. And it doesn't always work, but it's probably the most effective tip that I ever picked up as a parent was counting to 3, and I got it out of that book, which I read standing up in my coat, sweating in the Brooklyn Public Library. So the answer is, I was profoundly ignorant. I read these books in desperation. I couldn't, as I talk about the book, they have these kind of programs. 3-2-1 Magic is notable for it just wants you to count to 3. But others have whole ideas about, either it's a kind of behaviorist school where you ignore everything your child does because you don't want to give them reinforcement. And I would read that and I'd be like, yes, science has solved toddlers. We just ignore them. And they tested it on animals and it worked. And it just didn't. And either in that case, I just couldn't do it. I couldn't ignore. It would just get so extreme. I couldn't ignore it, and I would start yelling. And then I lost, and I could see Alan Kasdan, the author of this book that I read, being like, "You failed me," and then there was the opposite of that, which is the books that urge you to be empathetic and listen and so the most famous, the one that I read is very famous, is How to Talk So Your Kids Will Listen, How to Listen So Your Kids Will Talk, and that one, and you read that, you're like, oh no, that's the way, right? That's generous and empathetic, and so you mirror, and you say, oh, you want ice cream, but you can't have ice cream, that's so frustrating, and, but that doesn't work either, and I couldn't do it, I really couldn't do it. I could do it for a minute, and also Rafi was very skeptical of it. When Emily did it, she did it better than I did, but she really sold it, you were like, oh, she really is empathetic, where I'd be like, it's very frustrating. I just couldn't do it, and I just didn't, and I ended up not being able to kind of follow through on what I was being told to do in these books, and that also was a kind of a form of failure that became, sort of demoralizing.
Yes. Well, it's funny, there's a TikTok meme where it talks about how every day you start out as the empathetic parent, and by the end of the day, you're just a yelling parent. And I think that there is some truth to that with basically everyone.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I really enjoyed about Raising Raffi is that it did feel like a true addition to the dad-lit canon, because there are many books written by dads, and as you described in the book, and which I fully agree with, most of them just either go one of two directions. It's bumbling idiot, genius wife, and I can't do anything, and sort of learned helplessness, I think is the term. And I felt like yours was more reflective than most. And how much did you think about where it would fit into this dad-lit canon as you were conceiving it, as you were writing these sort of separate essays?
It was more. I hadn't really read many dad books. A lot of these books that are. It's kind of interesting. A lot of the books that are by experts, some of those books that I was talking about just now, a lot of them are written by men. But there are very few books written by men that are kind of like memoiristic accounts of parenthood. There are a lot written by women, which are fantastic, right? There's so many, and every time I would start reading one of those, I'd be like, oh, this is really good, and then I would pick up like a dad version of that, the few that exist, and I'd be like, oh, this is embarrassing to dads, and but it also didn't. I mean, part of the kind of impulse for the book was feeling kind of two things. One was like, as a man, I'm not, I kind of was watching Emily, who has so many friends, so many like mom friends, that she's always talking about being a mother with. And I have dad friends and we chat, but like, it's different. We're not as good at it.
What do you talk about? Oh, I want to know.
Sports. Yeah, I mean, we do talk about some dad stuff, but beer. I mean, it's like what you expect. It's nothing that interesting. And so there was a kind of like my feeling that like we dads weren't quite having the conversations that we should be having, but also not seeing. Like the first one I wrote was about teaching him Russian, and and kind of my mixed feelings about that, and I was like, oh, this is so interesting. I just haven't seen this described, right? And the next one I wrote was about schools. That's been written about a lot. Hadn't quite seen it from the situation that I was in, and on, and then the one that I read from, which was about like being an angry parent, but was in particular an angry dad, was not something that I had seen written about. So it was this kind of impulse to write about and describe things that I had not seen described, in particular by men. And then kind of later on, and then as I kind of finished the book, I was like, okay, what have I started looking at some of the kind of competition, right? And that's when I noticed like Dumb Dad, Super Dad, and I was like, oh, that just doesn't describe the dads that I know, right? Like we're like slightly bumbling, and slightly incompetent, but very well-meaning and kind of committed to it and serious about it. And we do think of it, I think most of us, as a pretty important thing that we're doing. And Dumb Dad doesn't quite do that justice, but we're not Super Dad either.
Do you see a marked sort of generational difference between the dads of roughly our dad's generation and dads of your vintage, and sort of how is it overlaid also with your dad's a Russian dad and you are a Russian American dad, and how does that all sort of interplay together? Yeah, I mean,
I think I describe in the book this conversation that I had with my dad about my second grade teacher, and during the pandemic, I became very, concerned. Like I was, making Rafi. He was in pre-K, and we were doing Zoom pre-K, and it was not. And he wasn't enjoying it. We weren't enjoying it. He had homework. Anyway, and I was like, should we really be doing this? We kept having fights with Emily about how much Zoom homework and whatever we should be doing. And I had this wonderful second grade teacher who, was very progressive, and I called her up on the phone and we kind of talked about, her theory of education. And I found it very helpful at that time. And she's like, really, you should just go outside. Like Zoom is probably not what he should be doing at 4 years old. And that kind of gave us permission to just kind of go outside and spend most of the pandemic outside, which was, I think, good advice. But then I was talking to my dad a few weeks later, and I was like, "Do you remember Ms. Lynch from second grade?" And my dad's like, "No." And I was like, "Well, surely you met her at like a parent-teacher conference." And he was like, "No, I was at work." And it was just such a funny thing. I was like, "Oh, it's just for you." My dad was very loving and very involved and drove me all my sports games, but it was inconceivable to him that he would go to a parent-teacher conference because he was at work, right? Whereas for me, it's like inconceivable to miss a parent-teacher conference because it's so interesting. You just get all the gossip, But I do, and I feel like most of the dads I know are really interested in what their kid is doing at school and who he's friends with and all that. And it is generational, and it's like, and there's all these I'm sure sociologists would have a better account of it, but it has to do with like the nature of the workplace and the nature of how we do work, but also just kind of like gender roles are evolving.
Yeah.
And I feel like we're a kind of transitional generation on the way to the future of total equality. But
You are a lot
we're
more
not there.
optimistic than
Yeah,
I
I mean, it might be maybe we're the first transitional generation. Yeah.
I really love the chapters about sports. I really want my daughters to play sports, but for sort of somewhat different reasons. I played a lot of sports, and they were really important for me in terms of self-esteem. I have 2 daughters, so I would love to hear you from your perspective. Talk about. I really like hearing the descriptions of you trying to teach Rafi to play hockey and how that went. So how's that going?
Yeah, I mean, part of the book is just kind of talking about what do I want to pass on? What do I have that I can give to my kids? And so, and then the problem is that I'm so like ambivalent about everything. So like I'm like, oh, Russian. I think it'd be kind of cool if Rafi learned Russian. But then on the other hand, would that mean he would go to Russia? That's not what I want for him. It's a terrible place. And then with sports, I played sports my whole life. It meant a lot to me. Rafi, at certain moments has seemed like he would be into sports. Was a very, very energetic child. As A's mom knows, a child who liked to wrestle with all his friends and knock them to the ground, as Rafi knows. Yes. And I was like, okay, this kid needs to play sports. And then whenever we would actually play a sport, and for me, the sport is hockey. Whenever he would actually play a sport, it would lead to a lot of frustration and him crying and lying on the ice and trying to eat the ice, which is disgusting because people spit on the ice and then it turns into snow, so it looks like snow, but it's actually spit. Don't eat it. So and then so me, and then me kind of pulling back and being like, okay, do what you want. I'm not gonna make you play hockey. But then, and we happen to be in a situation where he's skating and he can skate, So then I'm like, we're doing it. We're gonna play hockey. Anyway, so at the moment we're in a kind of slight. I've pulled back and given up. But I reserve the right to come back and try to make him play hockey again. It's one of those things where you're like, from the side, you're like, well, if your kid doesn't want to play hockey, don't make him. I grant you that. But on the other hand, if you don't, it's one of those things where but there's a lot of things like this in parenting where if you don't teach him how to skate, if he decides at the age of 12 he's going to play hockey, he's not going to be able to. He doesn't know how to skate.
Yeah, the thing about quitting too is something, a hill that I frequently die on. I really hate the idea of my kids quitting something before it has ended, no matter how much they hate it. I just think you should stick to it. And this is why Emily often makes fun of me that I'm like you. Because I'm just we signed up, you've made a commitment. I know you're 6, but this is a commitment. And I've had a lot of knockdown dragouts with my daughters. And I will also tell you, because my kids are a tiny bit older, this happened with soccer with us. And it just turned out my older daughter kind of stunk at soccer, and she's very good at basketball. So she really likes basketball because she's good at it. And that's also another terrible thing I passed on, which is only liking things that I'm good at. And so she's exactly like me in that way.
Yeah. I was actually, my dad, not a fount of parenting wisdom. He kind of he hasn't had many kids, but he doesn't like to theorize. But he was I was I'm trying to get Rafi to play sports. How did you get me to play sports? And he said, sports are fun when you're good at them.
Yeah.
And they're less fun when you're not. So, but again, how are you going to get good at them?
Yeah.
If you don't practice. Yeah. So that's a tough one. We'll see. But ultimately, the thing that actually, and this is quite recent, the thing that really has chilled Rafi out more than anything is learning how to read. And I can say that as a safe space to say that it's a bookstore. After, they start you learning to read so early. in the New York City schools. So like, starting in kindergarten, and like, he knew the letters, and we were like, okay, we're just like a month away from him, reading. And it was like that for a year and a half. Where like, he's almost there. And then one day, like after I had already like stopped thinking about it, it just happened. Actually, it happened after we got a Nintendo Switch for Hanukkah, which was a big fight in our family. I didn't want him to have a Switch. And he got this game called Animal Crossing, which it's like a role-playing game. It requires a lot of reading. So it was like the New York City Public Schools, his wonderful kindergarten teacher, his wonderful first grade teacher, and then Animal Crossing. That finally got him to read, and now he just kind of sits and reads on the couch. It's amazing.
Yeah, it's the greatest. So you do have a second child. What are the dynamics like between the two boys, and how has having a second child made you think potentially differently about the act of being a parent?
Oh, I mean, it's been revelatory. The main thing is, Ilya's so different. He is just, Rafi has dark hair, Ilya has light hair, Rafi has a dark complexion, Ilya has a light complexion, but like their personalities are just completely different. Ilya's incredibly easygoing, kind of self-sufficient, doesn't really need that much attention. Some of it is just being a second kid, but a lot of it is just, he's just different. And it does very much make you kind of rethink everything that happened and think, okay, Rafi was just like that. And it wasn't really something we did. I think I certainly might have made it worse by reacting to it as I did. Taking it personally. That's another thing you learn. Like when Rafi would say stuff to me like, "You're not nice. I hate you. I wish you would fall out the window." I would take that personally. And it's hard not to, because like, my baby. And then, I'd be like, "Oh, what's happening? Why? How did we get here?" And then Ilya, who's like the sweetest kid, turns 3, learns how to talk, and is like, "Dada, I don't like you. I wish you would disappear." And you're like, "Oh."
How 3-year-olds are.
Sorry?
It's just how 3-year-olds
That's just how they are. Yeah, either or it's me, but I don't know. I'm gonna go with that's how 3-year-olds are. So it has really transformed, like, retrospectively, and it's like too late for Rafi, right? For me to realize this, but I now realize that he was just 3, and he was 4.
Again, not all dads, but I find that my husband also takes things more personally than I do with the kids. Like he takes, when they're in a grumpy mood, he gets so irate about it, and I'm like, they're 5 and 9. They're just like that sometimes. Why do you think? Why are men, Keith? Why are they like that?
I think they're very sensitive.
Have you changed anything about your parenting as a result of writing this book, or as a result of talking about it to groups of people, or having it published?
I've certainly, like having, every parent who I've interacted with in this room, which is about half the people in this room, that's been the kind of most educational things in terms of just like picking up tips or just sharing experiences. That has been my university in parenting. As for the book, almost I have learned almost nothing, and it's very frustrating because you're like whenever I wrote that whole chapter about the whole essay about getting mad, and at the end of it, like we're in this period of he kind of chills out a little bit, and I chill out a little bit. I still get mad at him all the time, and I'm like, Rafi, we already did this. I already wrote the essay. This is not serving literature, but it's still happening. So that's very frustrating. You're like, I'm in this kind of trapped in Raising Raffi?
Well, Mike and I have done something where we have made our angry selves into characters, and we tell our children, angry mom is she's on deck, like she's gonna come, so you better, like, angry dad and angry mom are like separate people. They're not us. So I don't know if that's helpful to you.
might be too late for that, but that's a good idea.
I would love to open up for questions if anyone has questions for Keith.
You wrote a book about money and finances. How has writing this book made you reflect on your childhood and the money dynamics?
Let's repeat that question.
It's a great question.
Great question. So I read about money in the book and what it's like to not have quite enough of it when you have kids, and how has it made me reflect on my own childhood and money issues therein. I mean, I don't know if money in particular. I mean, money is a big part of the book. Used to be a much bigger part of the book, actually. And when Emily read the manuscript, she's like, "You just talk about money like on every page, just like 30% less money would be great." So that was a good edit. Thank you. I mean, so, it is one of the things that happens when you have a kid is you start thinking about, you're like, okay, what was it like for me as a kid, right? And it did make me realize that, like, some of to kind of close the loop on the earlier stuff, like, I ultimately came, and I talk about this in the book, like, I'm like, okay, I'm a Russian person, right? I came over when I was little, but, like, my parents were these people from the Soviet Union. We came over, we didn't have money. The only way that we were going to kind of enter American society was through school and doing well in school. And that, left like a pretty deep impression on me. I now am willing to admit. In a way that, like, even a few years ago, I would have been like, no, I'm like an American, kind of, I don't care about achievement. Everything's cool, and I'm now here, and like I'm ready to say that's not true, and I do, and it's in me, and I can't help it, and it comes out like with the kids and like around homework, for example. Just kind of realizing that was a powerful experience in my childhood. Interestingly, in the book, I'm like, I was an immigrant, and we moved from apartment to apartment, and I'll never be able to recreate that experience of precarity, for Rafi. But luckily, just a few months after I wrote that, we got kicked out of our apartment and are now, running around Brooklyn looking for an apartment, and Rafi will soon be moving into yet another apartment. So I have managed to recreate that for him.
More questions?
I have a, no, I'm just kidding.
I would love to hear it though.
No, it's fine.
Anew?
Hey, thank you for sharing your work with us, and congratulations. So for most writers, it's pretty difficult to, like, when you're writing something, you've always got this like monologue in your head of like, what will people think when this comes out into the world? But I imagine that when you're writing this, you're thinking, what will my family think when this comes out into the world? Though I imagine the process has been porous. I'm wondering if you could, for like first-time memoirists, someone who's attempting to write a memoir, could you give some tips on like how do you get over yourself? Like, how do you get over that concern of not just what will people think, but what will my family think, especially if you're not married to a memoirist like Emily?
I did not think of that. To be honest, and it kind of helps when you're like, when I'm writing something, I'm not like, this is going to get published, I don't think that, right? I'm just kind of like, oh, it'd be kind of cool if this got published, maybe, and that helps, right? Like, just kind of a lack of like confidence, I guess, or I don't know, or not learning from experience, or I don't know what it is. But yeah, I managed to kind of really not think about that stuff until it was time to think about it and panic about it and worry about it and then start sending it around and being like, is this okay? But yeah, I think if you were thinking about that all the time, it would be debilitating. So think that you're writing just for yourself. Nobody's ever going to see it, and then once if that becomes untrue, then go from there. But that will start. I mean, I have to say with in this, I mean, it's this also kind of a function of my ignorance. But like when I was writing a lot of this, Rafi was 3, he was 4, right? The idea of him reading it and having an opinion was really pretty far from my. He was a 3-year-old. I'm like, he's going to read this, he's going to care. And now, but it takes a while to write a book, right? And now he's 7, and he can actually read. He's read a little bit of it. His reactions have been very funny. I mean, he was like, he was mad at the end. I talk about him, putting one stool on top of another to get some candy. And he said, I don't do that anymore. As of like a few weeks ago, it's true, he does not do that. But then, and then he said, I'm going to write a book called Raising Raffi is Fake. By Raphael Gessen, where he will expose all the lies. I think that'd be amazing.
I have a question that's kind of for Jess.
Yeah.
Like, having read more of the parenting books and having read this book, like what are Keith's blind spots? What did he miss?
Well, first of all, I actually have not read that many parenting books. As a lay person, I've read books that I sort of then will write about or think about, but I'm too stubborn. And usually when I read parenting books that are didactic and trying to tell me how to do something, my reaction is go fuck yourself. Like and that's my knee jerk almost always. So that says something about me. Any blind spots? I don't know, man. Let me think about it. But I think this is stealing a line from Emily, which is that there is a little bit of like the Christopher Columbusing of like, oh, this is the first time anyone has ever done this, where it's like these are some tropes that are very familiar in the mom lit, which it does feel new because it is from a different perspective, but like there are certainly things that I recognized as like, yeah, that's from, I've read many mom lit books that sort of explore these topics or talk about things in this way. But I actually think I think more dads should read memoirs by moms about motherhood, and I think there should be more memoirs by dads written, because I think part of the reason things are unequal, of course, is because dads are not doing enough, but there is also, and I did not coin this term, but like in the sociological literature, it's like maternal gatekeeping, right? We assume they can't do it as well as we can do it. We don't let them fail. At the first time, and I will offer you this line, which I said frequently to my husband when we had our first baby, and he would be like, how do you do this? And I would say, I don't know, I don't speak baby. Like, I don't know either, she's crying. Like, so I think that you can sort of be clueless together, but that's what I say.
But Christopher Columbus, in defense of Christopher Columbus, I mean, he thought he was going to India. He was trying to
a lot of things. I saw it back here, I think.
I wanted to ask you to expand on that moment when you were talking about your inner Russian asserting itself and deciding that you do care about, achievement, as you put it, but the body language you used when you were pretending to be the American, when everything was good, and everything was going to be all right, like that whole laconic, chilled out thing. I'm sure you write about it, but could you talk a little bit about where that imperative comes from? whatever you were acting out, the pre-Russian Keith, where does that come from?
Wait, where's the American?
Where does that sort of insistence that it has to be easy, everything's cool?
Americans like you. Why do I guess that's my impression of Americans. I just think they seem like, I mean, maybe they're faking it. But you know, there is this kind of like idea that that these worries about school, right, and whether you do your homework and whether you get into Harvard, right, that this is for immigrants. And I mean, I certainly experienced that when I was like an immigrant growing up in, you know, Newton. You know, everybody wanted to get into Harvard, but like the immigrants really wanted to get into Harvard. And yeah. So the Americans they lost their edge a little bit. And I don't know. And I'm married to a very wonderful American who has a different attitude about school. You know, and I don't. You know, it's not necessarily because I'm Russian and she's American, but that is one way of explaining it.
My question is kind of a follow-up to the one you just answered. I wanted to ask about your writing process, and since you're Russian, were there ever any parts that you started writing in Russian, then translated into English, and would you ever consider translating the book into Russian?
Oh, I mean, the answer is no, and no. I mean, my Russian's not good enough. I mean, you know, there have been times where I've like spent so much time in Russian, I was like, oh, maybe I'll write this in Russian, and I start, you know, I write a few pages, and then I'm like, oh. That's not really Russian, is it? I mean, but my writing process is kind of like something happens to me, and then I'm like, why did that happen? And then the way I process experiences, I read, you know. So whether it's because I need advice or just like, you know, like that first chapter about Russian is about. You know, I found this linguist from the 1940s who had written this 4-volume diary of his daughters learning German in Chicago, and I was like, this is amazing. This is like exactly what I'm going through with Rafi, but much more sort of scientific. It began the opening paragraph of the book, of this 4-volume book, is a linguistic transcription of infant screaming. He's like, first it sounded like ah, and then it sounded like oh. it was just, but it's, you know, it's very accurately linguistically described. And you know, so then I'm like, so it's this kind of like dialectic or going back and forth between my experience and reading. Then I read, and then I experience some more stuff, you know, and then I read some more to understand it, and then like not always. Like there's a lot of essays that I started. I had this essay that I began about Instagram. I was like, Instagram. Like Emily has an Instagram. I really enjoy her Instagram. It's photos of our family, and with kind of wry commentary. And it's like a, you know, like it's very loving, but you know, it's not a kind of glamorous Instagram. But you know, it tries to make our family look nice. Our kids are very cute. But even so, I was like, oh, Instagram's so evil. Like I need to do the anti you know, on Instagram we're just like, it's just the bad stuff. You know, just like the poop and, you know, and like vomit, you know.
I call that
and,
a Finsta, like millennials call it a fake Instagram, like an Instagram reserved for like close friends and family, where you then vent about all the ugly and like the bad parts of the experience.
Okay, so this is happening, yeah. But I was like, you know, and I was like, but then I wasn't that committed to this, my poop Instagram, and you know, I was like, oh, it's probably, I can see why people don't do this, actually. It's not that appealing. I'm not sure that I would follow such an Instagram. But then I was like, okay, I'm gonna read some scientific literature on Instagram and see if there's like interesting thinking. And this was like, this is a while ago, this is like 3 years ago. And the first paper I read was actually about like how Instagram is this great thing. It's aspirational. If you photograph yourself, there was some line in it about how like, you photograph yourself with beautiful people in exotic settings, it will make it more likely for you to be invited to hang out with beautiful people in exotic settings. And this was like a sociological work. I mean, this
Called
is
manifesting.
manifest, yeah. And I was like, oh, that makes total sense, actually. That is what Instagram is. And then I abandoned that essay. So anyway, so I do, I will have, I guess that's my writing process, long answer to your question. But the other, I mean, I guess since I'm talking, the one book that did, the one book that I found that aside from 3 to 1 Magic, that I really feel like, and I talk about it at the end of the book, is this book by kind of a child developmental psychologist who's kind of an anthropologist, where he looks at 3-year-olds in different cultures. And I came to this book after reading the 2 famous books about parenting in other cultures, one being Bringing Up Baby, which is about how the French raise their kids better, and then Battle Hymn of the Tiger Mother, which is a kind of satirical book, but with a kind of serious claim that Chinese mothering or Chinese parenting is superior to Western parenting. And I'm a sucker, right? And so I read the French book, and I was like, oh, I want to be like a French parent. And then I read the Chinese book, and I was like, I want to be like a Chinese parent. And then I read this book that compared different kids in different cultures, and the argument of that book was simply that you are embedded in your place, in your city, in your country, in your particular cultural history, and you cannot simply wake up one day and become a French parent unless you're in France. And that was very helpful, and that was kind of like I don't know if that's the conclusion of the book, but it's kind of where I ended up. I was like, okay, I'm like a Russian person who lives in Brooklyn at this particular moment. I was looking for an apartment, and that's my situation, and I can't parent outside of that. What a speech.
Any other questions? All right. Thank you all so much for coming.
Thank you.